Celeste Mercer could have bought every building on the block where Sawyer Langley rented a room, but that night she sat hunched against a shuttered storefront in a torn jacket, pretending to be nobody. Dozens of people walked past her. Some avoided her eyes. Some muttered things under their breath. One man told her to move along before he called someone. Only Sawyer stopped. A single father, who had just been told his day's wages were void because of a paperwork dispute. A man with $7 in his pocket and a container of cold rice he had been saving for his last meal before the next paycheck that might never come. He looked at her. He looked at what he had. Then he handed it over without asking for anything in return. If you believe a single meal can bring down a $300 million empire, stay until the very end. Because that is exactly what happened here. The city of Portland had many faces, and Celeste Mercer had seen most of them from the wrong side of a conference room window. She had sat through dozens of presentations about Mercer Foundation's work in distressed neighborhoods. Slideshows full of before and after photographs, charts showing improved community outcomes, quotes from residents who claimed their lives had been changed by the Foundation's generosity. The numbers were always impressive. The language was always warm. And something about all of it had begun, quietly and persistently, to feel wrong. It was not a feeling she could name precisely. It was more like the specific discomfort of reading a letter from someone you love and realizing, halfway through, that none of the details match what you know to be true. So Celeste did something that no one in her position was supposed to do. She stopped trusting the reports and decided to see for herself. She borrowed clothes from a donation bin, a gray fleece with a cracked zipper, jeans with a torn knee, sneakers that were half a size too small. She left her phone, her credit cards, and her name in the glove compartment of a car parked 6 blocks away, and she walked into one of the neighborhoods where Mercer Foundation had recently announced a new community revitalization initiative. The area sat just northwest of the downtown core, a cluster of older, low-rise apartments and small businesses that had somehow survived the city's expanding appetite for redevelopment. She had read in a foundation summary that the area was being carefully transitioned towards sustainable growth. She wanted to know what that looked like from street level. What it looked like, as it turned out, was a cold sidewalk and no one stopping. For nearly 4 hours, Celeste sat near the corner of a closed, dry cleaning shop whose handwritten sign said it would reopen in spring. A sign that had clearly been there for more than one spring. People moved past her in both directions. A woman in a wool coat pulled her bag closer to her body without breaking stride. 2 teenage boys slowed down just long enough to nudge each other and laugh. A man in a delivery uniform stepped around her like she was a crack in the pavement. One shop owner came out and told her, politely at first and then not, that she was bad for business and needed to find somewhere else to be. Celeste moved without argument. She sat down somewhere else and counted the faces. She had been invisible before, at galas where no one remembered her name, in meetings where her questions went unanswered. But this was a different kind of invisible. This was the kind that made people feel entitled to look through you. She had set out to investigate the Foundation's programs. What she was learning in those first hours was something the programs were never designed to measure: the specific texture of being disregarded. It was colder than she expected, heavier. And it had been going on in this neighborhood, for real people, long before she showed up in borrowed clothes to observe it for a single evening. That thought stayed with her, uncomfortable and insistent, as the sky darkened and the temperature dropped and the street grew quieter. She tucked her knees to her chest and watched the corner where a Mercer Foundation banner, navy blue with gold lettering, freshly printed, hung above what was supposed to be a community resource center. The lights inside were off. It was 6:45 on a Wednesday evening. It was supposed to be open until 9. Sawyer Langley turned onto that same block at 7:15, moving with the particular exhaustion of a man whose body has absorbed more bad news than it was built to carry in a single day. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and a face that was still honest, despite everything that had tried to make it otherwise. He had spent the morning on a remodeling crew in a building 2 miles east, doing tile work on bathroom floors, the kind of repetitive physical labor he had learned to be good at in the 2 years since the warehouse job disappeared, and he had needed to become someone who could find work in smaller, less predictable pieces. He was good with his hands and reliable, and showed up on time, which were qualities that should have been enough. But at 4 o'clock that afternoon, the contractor had told him the payment was being held because Sawyer's contractor license paperwork had a processing delay, a delay Sawyer had not caused and could not fix before the end of the week. $7. That was what he had. $7 in a worn billfold and a plastic container of leftover rice and black beans that his daughter, Mia, had packed for him that morning before she left for school. She was 9 years old and already understood, in the way children of careful parents understand things, that packing extra was a form of love. Sawyer had meant to eat it at lunch, but a part of him had been saving it, the way you save the last of something, when you are not sure when the next supply is coming. Now it sat in his jacket pocket as he walked, and he was calculating, automatically and without drama, because calculation had become its own kind of habit, how he was going to get through the next 4 days, until the licensing issue resolved and he could collect what he was owed. He passed the dry cleaning shop with the old spring sign. He passed the Mercer Foundation banner above the dark windows, and then he saw Celeste. She was sitting against the wall of a building, knees pulled up, arms wrapped around herself. Her jacket was inadequate for the temperature. Her shoes were wrong. She was not performing distress. She was simply sitting there, still and quiet, the way people sit when they have stopped expecting anything from the moment they are in. Sawyer slowed down. He was not the kind of man who stopped for strangers by default. The city had taught him caution the same way it had taught everyone else. But he had a daughter at home who packed his lunch in the morning, and something about the way this woman was sitting reminded him, sharply and without warning, of a version of a future he spent every day trying to prevent. He stopped. He asked if she was all right. She looked up at him with dark eyes that seemed to be calculating him in the same moment he was calculating her, and said she was fine, which was such an obvious untruth in that weather that it almost made him smile. He asked if she had eaten. She said she was okay. He took the container out of his jacket pocket and held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment and then at him, and she said he didn't have to do that. He said he knew he didn't have to. Then he set it down beside her, told her there was a church 3 blocks north that left its side door unlocked on cold nights, and walked on down the street, hands in his empty pockets, his stomach quietly noting the absence. Celeste did not eat the rice right away. She sat with the container in her hands and felt something shift inside her chest. Not sentiment exactly, but something close to recalibration. She had been studying this neighborhood for 4 hours and had concluded, with the detached precision she had inherited from years of boardroom training, that the community support Mercer Foundation claimed to be providing was at minimum overstated. That conclusion had been intellectual. What had just happened was not. She waited until Sawyer had turned the corner, and then she stood up and followed him at a distance, because she needed to understand what kind of person gives away their dinner on a Wednesday night in November. She caught up to him near a convenience store where he was standing at the window, looking at the prices of things through the glass. She said she wanted to ask him something. He turned, unsurprised by her presence in the way tired people are sometimes unsurprised by things that would have startled them on a better day. She asked why he had helped her, given that he was clearly not in a position that made generosity easy. Sawyer was quiet for a moment. Then he said that hunger was not a test of character, and it should not be treated like one. He said that too many people used the question of whether a poor person deserved help as a reason to never help at all, and he had decided a long time ago that he was not going to be one of those people. The sentence landed in Celeste's chest with the force of something she had heard before but never understood. In the 47 board meetings she had attended since assuming her role at Mercer Foundation, she had heard the phrase "deserving recipients" used so many times and with so little irony that it had stopped registering as the problem it was. The Foundation's internal language sorted people into categories: the temporarily displaced, the structurally vulnerable, the chronically dependent, as if human beings could be filed and retrieved. Sawyer did not sort people. He had seen a woman sitting cold and hungry on a sidewalk and had acted accordingly. That was the whole of his moral architecture, and it was, Celeste realized, more solid than anything she had helped build with $100 million and a team of communications consultants. She did not tell him who she was, not that night. She said her name was Claire and that she was trying to figure out the neighborhood, which was true in every way that mattered. Sawyer nodded. He seemed to accept partial truths the way a person accepts weather, not gratefully, but without wasted argument. He told her a little about the area as they stood outside the store. That it had been changing fast in the past 18 months, that rents had started climbing after a series of new property management companies appeared, that some of his neighbors had received official-looking notices they did not fully understand and had been afraid to question. He said it like he was describing the price of lumber, with the steady resignation of a man who has watched systems work against people for long enough that he no longer expects surprise, only documentation. Sawyer's daughter, Mia, had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and she had grown up in apartment 214 of the Glenfield Arms, on a block that had once felt like a neighborhood, and was increasingly beginning to feel like something being quietly dismantled. Sawyer had moved there 3 years ago, after the warehouse closed and the severance ran out, and the apartment he and his wife had shared became the apartment he shared alone with a 9-year-old who asked fewer questions than she should have, which was its own kind of heartbreak. He had made the Glenfield Arms into a home through sheer insistence. A good mattress for Mia, a kitchen table they had found and repainted together, a wall calendar where he tracked his jobs and she tracked her reading goals in alternating colors. The building was old and the heat was unreliable, and the super was a man named Carl who resolved problems in inverse proportion to their urgency, but it was theirs. And Sawyer was very clear with himself about the difference between circumstances and character. The circumstances were difficult. His character was not going to become the same. He had learned his trade skills piecemeal, tile work from a foreman who had taken him on as a favor to someone, drywall from a tutorial series he had watched on a library computer, plumbing basics from a neighbor who was generous with knowledge, if not with time. He was not licensed in the full formal sense, which was a problem that kept returning like a slow leak he couldn't quite locate, always manageable until the moment it wasn't. He had applied for the proper certification twice. Both times the process had stalled in administrative delays he could not afford to follow up on during working hours, because working hours were when he was working. The system was not designed, he had concluded, for people who could not afford to stop doing the thing they needed the system to certify them to do. What Sawyer did not know, on the evening he handed Celeste his dinner, was that the building where he had built the closest thing he had to a stable life had appeared in a confidential acquisition spreadsheet circulated internally within Mercer Holdings, the for-profit subsidiary of Mercer Foundation. 4 months earlier, the Glenfield Arms was listed alongside 14 other low-income residential buildings in the northwest quadrant of Portland, all of them flagged for what the document called Phase 2 Community Transition. In practice, this meant they were scheduled to be emptied, renovated, and relaunched at market-rate rents that would make them inaccessible to every person currently living in them. The document had never been shown to Celeste. It had been prepared by a man named Vaughn Mercer, her uncle, who had been running the foundation's operations for the past 6 years. With the absolute confidence of a person who has never been questioned by anyone with the authority to stop him. The Resource Center on Alderton Street had a sign in the window that said it was open Monday through Saturday, 9 in the morning to 9 at night, and that it offered employment assistance, housing counseling, legal aid referrals, and emergency food support. Celeste visited it the next morning, still in her borrowed clothes, and found a single volunteer, a young woman named Britt, who could not have been older than 22, managing a space that had been designed for 6 staff members. The shelves that were supposed to hold donated goods were 2/3 empty. The computer terminal for job searches had a handwritten out-of-order sign on it. The legal aid referral program, Britt explained carefully, had not had an active attorney partner in 4 months. When Celeste asked about the food support, Britt pointed to a table with a cardboard box containing 7 canned goods and some individually wrapped crackers. The Foundation's most recent annual report had described the Alderton Street Center as a flagship initiative, serving over 200 clients per month. Celeste had read that sentence. She had approved the language. She had done so in a conference room with good lighting and a catered lunch, surrounded by people whose job was to make the numbers look right, and she had not thought to ask what 200 clients per month actually looked out like at street level at 7 in the evening on a Wednesday. She sat in one of the plastic chairs in the resource center while Britt answered a phone call about a family that had received an eviction notice they did not understand, and she listened to Britt say, carefully and with evident practice, that she could add them to the list and someone would follow up. She watched Britt write the name on a yellow legal pad that already had 22 other names on it. Then she thanked Britt for her time and walked outside and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment before she trusted herself to think clearly. The Foundation's reports had not lied, exactly. They had simply described a reality that bore the same relationship to the truth as a photograph bears to a room, technically accurate about surfaces, silent about everything underneath. The center existed, clients did come, numbers were logged. And in the gap between those facts and what they implied, Vaughn had constructed a narrative of success that had been presented to donors, to city officials, and to Celeste herself with the smoothness of something that had been rehearsed many times. She began to understand that what she had been reading for 3 years was not a report on the Foundation's work. It was a stage set, maintained at modest cost, standing in for a program that had been quietly redirected toward a purpose the Foundation's charter had never intended. She walked back toward the Glenfield Arms. She needed to speak to Sawyer Langley again. She needed to understand the gap between what was being documented and what was actually happening to actual people, and she had a feeling, grounded and specific, not merely instinctual, that he was standing at the center of it. Vaughn Mercer was 61 years old and had the manner of a man who had never been in a room where he was not, by his own estimation, the most important person present. He had come to Mercer Foundation 6 years ago following the death of Celeste's father, Robert, who had founded both the foundation and the holding company with the stated conviction that commerce and conscience were not in opposition, that a family business could generate wealth and also protect the communities that made that wealth possible. Robert had written those convictions into the foundation's founding documents with the specificity of a man who did not entirely trust the people who would come after him. Vaughn had read those documents carefully in the weeks after Robert's death and had decided that what they contained were aspirations, not constraints, and that aspirations were, by their nature, subject to interpretation. The deal he was finalizing was with a real estate investment group out of Chicago called Halcyon Capital Partners. The total value was $300 million. Halcyon was acquiring a portfolio of 17 properties across Portland's northwest quadrant. Properties that had been acquired over the previous 4 years using a combination of foundation funds, private investment routed through Mercer Holdings, and grants that had originally been designated for community development. The transaction required, as a condition of closing, documentation proving that the properties had been successfully cleared of existing low-income tenants through what Vaughn's paperwork described as voluntary relocation support. The Mercer Foundation's community programs, the Alderton Street Center, the housing counseling services, the legal aid referrals, had been designed and cited in those documents as evidence of that voluntary support. In other words, the Foundation's charitable work was not a complement to the real estate transaction. It was its legal justification. And it was a justification that depended entirely on no one looking too closely at whether the support had actually been provided or merely described. Vaughn had 72 hours before the final closing documents needed to be executed. He had received word that morning, through a contact at a local news organization, that a journalist named Whitney Boone had been making calls about Mercer Foundation's financial flows. He had also received word that Celeste had not been at her apartment for 2 nights. Neither piece of information was catastrophic on its own. Together, they had the specific gravitational weight of a problem that was about to become much larger. He poured himself coffee, sat at his desk on the 14th floor of the Mercer building, and began making phone calls. Celeste found Sawyer the next evening outside the Glenfield Arms, repairing a loose railing on the front steps with a wrench and a section of hardware he had bought himself. He looked up when she approached and registered no particular surprise, which she was beginning to understand was just how his face worked, steady, assessing, not unkind. She said she wanted to buy him coffee. He said that was probably backwards. She said she was serious. He put down the wrench and told Carl, who had appeared briefly in the doorway, that the railing was done. They walked to a diner 2 blocks away called Penny's, which smelled of coffee and fried bread and had booths with cracked vinyl that someone had repaired with electrical tape in colors that didn't match. Sawyer ordered 2 coffees and paid for them with what was clearly a deliberate decision rather than a casual one. Celeste wrapped her hands around the mug and listened. She asked him about the neighborhood. He talked, and what came out was not complaint, it was inventory. He named people, Donna Reyes, a woman in her 60s who had lived in the building for 11 years and received a notice saying her lease was being converted to month. Frank and Barbara Ortiz, who ran a small alterations business on the ground floor and had been told their commercial lease would not be renewed. A man named Dennis who worked night shifts and had shown up one evening to find a padlock on his storage unit with no explanation. Sawyer said he had collected copies of most of the notices because it had occurred to him that someone should. He said he didn't know what they added up to, but he didn't think you were supposed to throw away paper that had a lawyer's name on it. Celeste asked him about his own situation, carefully, in the way you ask someone a question you already partially know the answer to. He told her about the certification delay and the contractor, who had used it as a pretext not to pay. He said it without self-pity, the way you describe a weather pattern. This is what the season is doing. Here is how I am navigating it. He asked her, over the second cup of coffee he had not asked Penny for, but she had brought anyway because the diner was quiet and she had eyes, what her situation was. Celeste said she was trying to figure out what was actually happening in this neighborhood versus what people were saying was happening. Sawyer looked at her for a long moment. He said those two things tended to be different everywhere, in his experience. But they were especially different in places where people with money had decided something valuable was being underused. Whitney Boone had been a reporter for 11 years and had developed, over that time, a reliable instinct for the specific texture of money that does not want to be found. She had been tipped off to the Mercer Foundation situation by an anonymous source 6 weeks earlier. A former accounting contractor who had processed a series of fund transfers that did not match their stated designations. The transfers were not dramatic on their face. They were the kind of thing you might miss in a 40-page financial summary if you were not specifically looking for the gap between where money was described as going and where it actually went. Whitney had been specifically looking for exactly that gap, and what she had found was a pattern, steady, systematic, and documented across 4 fiscal years, of foundation charitable funds being routed through a subsidiary called Community Bridge Partners, which was wholly owned by a holding company controlled by Von Mercer, and from there into property acquisition accounts that appeared in no foundation disclosure to any regulatory body. She had found Sawyer Langley through a housing advocacy organization that had been trying, with limited success, to compile a record of irregular eviction notices in the Northwest Quadrant. Sawyer had contacted the organization 6 weeks earlier to share copies of notices he had collected from neighbors who didn't know what to do with them. Whitney had called him on a Thursday, and he had answered on the second ring and spoken to her in the careful, factual manner of a person who had decided that the truth was the safest territory to occupy. He had 4 notices, including his own, and a letter from a property management company whose registered address Whitney discovered within 1 hour of the call, traced back through 2 shell entities to Mercer Holdings. She had called her editor. Her editor had said, "Prove it before we run anything." She was methodically and without fanfare in the process of doing exactly that. What Whitney did not yet know, and what would change the texture of her story considerably, was that the person who had been sitting on a Portland sidewalk 2 nights ago pretending to have nothing was the heir to everything the story was about. Celeste told Sawyer the truth on a Friday afternoon in the parking lot of the Glenfield Arms, standing beside the same front railing he had repaired 3 days earlier. She said her name was not Claire. She said her full name was Celeste Mercer, and that Mercer Foundation was her family's organization. and that she had come to this neighborhood in borrowed clothes because she had stopped being able to trust the reports she was receiving about what the foundation was doing with the resources it had been entrusted to manage. She said it plainly and without theatrical apology, because she had decided that the only honest way to confess a deception was to stop performing around it. Sawyer did not say anything for a long moment. His expression moved through several things before it settled, and none of them were gentle. He said that he had given her his dinner. He said he had told her about Donna Reyes and Frank and Barbara Ortiz and Dennis and the padlocks and the notices. He said he had assumed, in some basic and apparently naive way, that what he was dealing with was a person. She said she was a person. He said that rich people who dressed up as poor people to test strangers were not dealing with other people. They were collecting them. And there was a difference. And he needed her to understand that difference before she said another word. He was not shouting. His voice was completely level, which was somehow harder to hear than anger. Celeste said he was right. She said she had been wrong to withhold who she was, and that the justification she had given herself, that she needed to see the neighborhood without the filter of her name, did not excuse the specific experience of having been deceived by someone who had the ability to change your circumstances and chose instead to observe them. She said she had come to tell him the truth because she needed his help, and she was not willing to ask for it under false pretenses. She said that whatever happened next, she wanted it to happen honestly. Sawyer looked at her for a long time. Then he said the notices were in a folder in his apartment and he would go get them. Gideon Hart was 73 years old and had the unhurried precision of a man who had spent 5 decades being the person in the room who knew where the original document was. He had been Robert Mercer's attorney for 21 years, and he had retired 3 years ago, and he had been waiting, with the patient certainty of someone who has read the relevant clause and knows what it says, for the day when someone with the right to ask would come and ask the right question. Celeste arrived at his home office on a Saturday morning with Sawyer beside her, carrying a folder of notices, and she asked Gideon what, exactly, her father's founding documents said about the use of foundation assets in real estate transactions. Gideon went to his filing cabinet, a physical one, 4 drawers, unlocked, because he had decided that the most important documents in his possession were the ones that would become worthless if no one could access them, and he removed a folder that was thicker than the one Celeste had been shown at the time of her father's death. He said that what she had been given at the time of the estate settlement was a summary, and that summaries, in his experience, were only as honest as the person who made them. The full founding document contained a specific clause, written in Robert Mercer's own hand and incorporated into the legal text at his insistence, that prohibited the use of foundation assets to acquire residential properties for the purpose of displacement, market rate conversion, or resale at profit. The clause defined displacement broadly. It included any process, whether direct or through affiliated entities, that resulted in the involuntary departure of existing tenants from foundation-adjacent properties. It also stated that any trustee or officer found to have violated the clause would forfeit their role in the foundation and be subject to full financial review. Gideon had a second document as well. It was a handwritten letter from Robert Mercer, dated 2 years before his death, addressed to no one specific and to whoever needed it. In it, Robert wrote that he had seen something changing in the way Vaughn spoke about the foundation's assets, a gradual drift from the language of stewardship toward the language of leverage, and that he was worried about what would happen when he was no longer there to push back. He wrote that the foundation was not an investment vehicle and was not to be treated as one, and that anyone who read this letter and had the power to say so should say so loudly. Celeste read the letter twice. The second time, she did not read it out loud, which was good, because her voice had stopped working correctly somewhere in the middle of the first paragraph. Sawyer watched her from across the table. He did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the room was not already saying. He put his folder of notices on the table beside Gideon's documents and aligned the corners carefully, the way a person aligns things when they want to demonstrate quietly that what they are bringing is serious. Vaughn Mercer called Celeste on Sunday morning. He said he knew she had been in the neighborhood and that he understood she was concerned, but that her concern, while understandable, was based on an incomplete picture, and he would like the opportunity to show her the complete one. Celeste said she thought she had a fairly complete picture at this point. Vaughn said that she was too close to certain individuals and that this was affecting her judgment. He said that people in difficult situations sometimes looked for benefactors, and that it was important not to confuse genuine distress with strategic distress. Celeste said she was not sure she understood the distinction. Vaughn said that the man she had been spending time with, and yes, he knew about Sawyer, was someone who had received notice of a lease adjustment like every other tenant in the building, and that if he had characterized it as something sinister, he was either mistaken or he had reasons for doing so that were not entirely innocent. Then Vaughn said the thing that removed the last ambiguity about who he was and what he was willing to do. He said that if Sawyer Langley continued to interfere with Foundation operations, the lease adjustment process could be accelerated for the Glenfield Arms, which would put the family in question out of their apartment in considerably less time than the current timeline allowed. He said it in the tone of a man making a practical observation. He said it the way you describe a weather pattern. This is what the season is doing. Celeste recognized the phrasing because Sawyer had used it, and because hearing it in Vaughn's mouth made it into something entirely different. She said she understood what he was telling her. She said she would be in touch. Then she called Whitney Boone. It began with a photograph. A property blog, not well known but widely read in certain business circles, published a small item saying that a single father in Portland had developed an unusual relationship with the Mercer Foundation heiress. It described Sawyer as an opportunistic tenant who had inserted himself into the Foundation's affairs and was attempting to use a manufactured grievance about eviction notices to extract favorable treatment. There was a photograph, taken from a distance, slightly blurry, showing Sawyer and Celeste outside the Glenfield Arms. The item had no named author. 2 days after it appeared, 2 contracting firms that had been considering Sawyer for work contacted him to say they were passing on the opportunity. One of them was apologetic. The other did not explain. Sawyer called Celeste and told her what had happened without dramatics, in the same tone he used for everything. Here is the situation. Here is what it means. She told him she was sorry. He said the apology was not the thing he needed. He said the thing he needed was for this to stop being a situation where one person's wealth was being used to decide which version of events became the true one. He said that if she wanted to help, genuinely, structurally, in the way that changed things rather than temporarily softening them, she needed to address what was being done to the whole neighborhood, not simply fix his particular part of it. She said she knew. He said he was glad she knew, but knowledge and action were different things, and he had met plenty of people who knew and did nothing, and he was asking her to be different. Celeste thought about her father's letter. She thought about the clause in the founding documents. She thought about Donna Reyes and the 22 names on Britt's yellow legal pad. Then she called Gideon Hart and asked him to be available on Thursday. She called Whitney Boone and asked how close she was to having what she needed. She called the foundation's independent board members, the 3 who had not been appointed by Vaughn, and asked for an emergency session. She told them she had something they needed to see before any further action was taken on the Halcyon transaction. Then she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while she read her father's letter one more time, and she understood, with the quiet force of something that has always been true but only recently arrived, that the work she had been doing for 3 years had not been her father's work. It had been her absence dressed in his name. The boardroom on the 14th floor of the Mercer building had been designed to communicate authority. High ceilings, a table that seated 20, windows that looked out over the city in a way that made everything below look like it was being overseen rather than seen. Vaughn arrived 20 minutes early and arranged his documentation in the precise order that would allow him to walk the board through the Halcyon transaction in a sequence that would make questioning it feel like the unreasonable option. He had done this before. He was very good at it. He was positioned and ready when the doors opened and Celeste walked in, and it was only when he saw who was behind her that the precision of his arrangement became, in the space of one heartbeat, irrelevant. Gideon Hart carried the founding documents in a leather portfolio. Whitney Boone carried a printed report that was 31 pages long and had her name on it, which meant it was already filed with her editor and would be published regardless of what happened in the next hour. Sawyer Langley carried a folder, thin and slightly worn at the edges, containing the notices he had collected from his neighbors over the course of 8 months. Because it had seemed to him that paper with a lawyer's name on it was the kind of thing you kept. Celeste did not begin with the legal documents. She began with a description of a Wednesday evening in November, a storefront in the northwest quadrant, a Mercer Foundation banner above a dark window, a community resource center that was not open during the hours it claimed to be open. She described what she had seen and what it meant, not in the language of quarterly reports, but in the specific physical language of being there. She described the 22 names on Britt's legal pad. She described Donna Reyes and Frank and Barbara and Dennis. Then she laid the founding document on the table and pointed to the clause her father had written in his own hand, and she read it aloud in a room that had gone very still. Gideon presented the financial flow documentation. Whitney's report outlined the Community Bridge Partners structure and the trail between charitable funds and Halcyon acquisition accounts. Sawyer did not present a document. He described, in the same level and factual voice he used for everything, the morning he had found a padlock on his storage unit with no explanation, and the afternoon a contractor had told him his payment was being held, pending a license delay he could not resolve without taking time off from the work he needed to pay for the time it would take to resolve the delay. He described handing his last meal to a stranger on a sidewalk, and the stranger turning out to be the person whose family's name was on the building, where he was afraid he was about to become homeless. He said it without accusation. He said it the way you describe what happened, because what happened was enough. The 3 independent board members voted to suspend the Halcyon transaction, pending a full financial review. They did not look at Vaughn when they voted. The suspension was unanimous. Vaughn said Celeste had destroyed $300 million because she had developed a sentimental attachment to someone she had met while conducting what he called a stunt. He said this with the practiced authority of a man who had spent years being correct by default, which had made it difficult for him to recognize the specific moment when the room had stopped being on his side. He said she was going to regret this when she understood what she had cost the family. Celeste said that if $300 million required the displacement of 200 families from their homes, then the cost had already been paid. It had just been paid by people who had not been invited to the meeting where it was decided. She said she was not certain what her father's foundation was supposed to be, but she was absolutely certain what it was not, and what it was not was a mechanism for using the language of charity to make real estate speculation more legally defensible. The board placed Vaughn on administrative leave pending the investigation. It was phrased in the careful, institutional language these things are always phrased in, pending review, in the interest of governance, without prejudice to ultimate findings. The substance was less careful and more permanent. Vaughn Mercer left the 14th floor of the building that bore his brother's name, and the door closed behind him with the ordinary sound of ordinary doors, which was its own kind of judgment. Celeste stood at the window after he left and looked out at the city in a way that was not oversight. Whitney Boone left to file her story. Gideon Hart put his portfolio away and shook Celeste's hand and said Robert would have done the same thing, which was the most useful thing anyone had said to her in years. Sawyer Langley picked up his folder, tucked it under his arm, and said he needed to get home because Mia had a school project due in the morning. Celeste spent the following 3 months doing something she had not done in the 3 years since she took over the foundation. She read the founding documents as instructions rather than history. She stopped the lease adjustment process on every property in the Northwest Quadrant portfolio. She convened a community advisory process that was not a consultation, meaning it was not a meeting where residents were asked to ratify decisions already made, but a genuine process in which the people most affected by the foundation's work were given actual authority over how it was shaped. She restructured the Alderton Street Center with 6 full-time staff members and a legal aid partnership with a firm that had, for reasons of professional ethics, declined to work with Vaughn's version of the foundation. She also called Sawyer and asked if he would consider joining the Community Advisory Board. She was specific about why, not because his story was useful to her, and not because it was good optics, but because the foundation had been making decisions about communities for years without including anyone who had actually lived inside the consequences of those decisions, and that was not a gap she wanted to close with another outside expert. Sawyer said he would think about it. 2 weeks later, he called back and said yes. He said he would want to be able to say things that people did not want to hear, and she said that was precisely why she was asking him. He also accepted a contract, a formal one, with a scope of work and a payment schedule, to manage repair and maintenance work on 3 of the foundation's residential buildings. It was not a gift. It was a job, and it paid fairly, and it used the skills he had spent 2 years building under a system that kept finding reasons to question whether they counted. The paperwork for his contractor certification came through 6 weeks later. He was pretty sure it had come through without intervention. Celeste said nothing to indicate otherwise. He decided to accept that ambiguity, because there were things you let go of when you were trying to move forward, and the source of bureaucratic competence was one of them. The following spring, the Northwest Quadrant was still there. The Glenfield Arms was still there, with a repaired railing on the front steps and a boiler that now worked with the consistency of something that had been professionally serviced rather than periodically apologized to. Donna Reyes still lived in her apartment. Frank and Barbara Ortiz still had their commercial lease. Dennis still had access to his storage unit. The Mercer Foundation banner on Alderton Street had been taken down and replaced with a hand-painted sign that listed actual hours and actual services, because Britt, who had been offered a full-time position, had insisted on making it specific. The Halcyon Capital transaction had been declined by the Foundation's board, and the subject was being reviewed by the State Attorney General's office. Vaughn Mercer had retained counsel. Celeste came back to the neighborhood on a Saturday in April, in her own clothes, with her own name. She walked to Penny's diner and sat down in the same booth with the cracked vinyl, repaired with the electrical tape in colors that didn't match. Sawyer was already there. Penny brought 2 coffees without being asked, because she had been bringing Sawyer coffee since before any of this and Celeste since after, and she had decided that made them both regulars. They sat for a while without saying much, because not everything that matters requires explanation, and they had both developed a tolerance for the kind of silence that is not the absence of something, but the presence of it. Sawyer said he did not think of himself as someone who had done anything particular. He said he had given a stranger a container of food on a cold night because it was the thing to do. Celeste told him that what he had actually given her was something she had been sitting in the middle of the ability to do for years without knowing how, and that it had taken a meal she had not needed to receive, offered by someone who could not afford to give it, to make her understand what her father had written and why. She said she was still learning the difference between funding something and caring about it. Sawyer said that was probably a difference worth learning. She said she agreed. Outside, the street moved with its ordinary Saturday energy. A woman pushing a stroller, 2 men unloading boxes from a truck, a child running ahead of a parent who was almost but not quite keeping up. The new sign on the Alderton Street Center was visible from where they sat. Celeste looked at it for a moment. Then she looked back at the table and picked up her coffee. The city made the sounds a city makes, and Sawyer had somewhere to be later, and so did she, and this was all right, because the point was not that anything had been completed. The point was that for the first time in a long time, the things that needed to be done were being done by the people who should have been doing them, in the place where they actually needed to be done. Somewhere in the northwest quadrant, in a building that had been repaired rather than emptied, a 9-year-old girl was packing a lunch for the following Monday. She packed extra, because that was the habit she had learned, and habits learned from love were the ones that outlasted everything else. Celeste Mercer could have bought every building on the block, and in the end, she chose to leave them standing.